Hello, everyone. Thanks for jumping into this month's OKC Design+Tech meetup. We're happy to have you on. This is the end of Pride Month, and we have an awesome speaker today who I'll introduce shortly. Just so you know, we all really appreciate everyone who jumps into our meetups and events. We're an active community. We go ahead and we have streams on design-related topics, especially UX design-related topics, every month. We have some awesome co-organizers that are all coordinating at the same time. We have Gaia, Alec, Jarvis, and Tori, and me as well. If you have any questions about an event, doing a talk, talking at an event, or any questions in general about our meetup, I encourage you to reach out to any one of us via LinkedIn or in our Slack. Also today, we're streaming on Twitch, but we will also, the Twitch chat is muted. So we want everyone to go ahead and jump into the stream for the questions and everything in our Slack channel. And that is techlahoma.slack.com. And in there, we have a channel for OKC Design+Tech. If you have any questions during the talk, please toss them in there. I'll be monitoring them and I'll pass them on to our speaker. For announcements, this month, or next month, the 11th, is going to be a free code camp event on Sunday the 11th, and that is run by Kimberly Collins and some of the other user group leaders in Techlahoma. It's going to be a really great event, so I encourage everyone to go ahead and check them out on the meetup page just to find out more information so that you can see about going. For OKC Design+Tech, our next meetup will be the end of July. So it'll be the last Wednesday in July. We always meet on the last Wednesday, unless we change that, and we'll let you know if we change that. We will have another talk at that time, and we'll keep you posted for what we have during that time. So for today's talk, I am very happy to welcome Stephen Wakabayashi. He actually reached out to Techlahoma, so he found out about us on the internet and wanted to reach out to us about just reaching out to our community. He is the founder of QT BIPOC Design, which is an organization that provides accessible education, design education, and mentorship to everybody in the LGBTQ+ community and people of color as well. And he reached out to us just to kind of get to know our community and reach out to anybody who might be underrepresented in our community. As you know, today, this month, June, is Pride Month, and we're at the very, very end. And it's awesome to have somebody like Stephen over here talking for us. He's going to be giving a talk on how to get more equitable designs by having inclusion in just the whole process. Really appreciate him jumping on. It's going to be exciting to hear what he says. So Stephen, thank you very much. You can go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction. And if you want to throw the questions into the Google chat, I'm looking at that as well, so I can answer any questions that come through if it is in real time or it's relevant in the presentation. Yeah, so excited to chat with you all today on our creative teams. How do we include more equity into our culture, our community, ultimately improving diversity, equity, and inclusion overall in our teams? And my name is Stephen, founder and president of an organization, a nonprofit organization called QT BIPOC Design, QT BIPOC Design, that provides free design education to LGBTQ+ designers of color. I've been in this industry for a long time, and diversity has been a huge pain point from many teams I've managed and I've led. And especially since all the things that's been happening in our culture with BLM and figuring out ways that we can give more representation to our most marginalized folks, especially trans and non-binary communities. Started this nonprofit organization with a team of my friends, and we have been creating monthly meetups. We have an active Slack channel, and we just recently launched our UX Bootcamp course. We provide free education over a 12-week period to train folks on UX fundamentals, ethics, and accessibility. And so with that, this presentation is just going to be showing you a little bit about us as an organization, some of our insights into why we're doing what we're doing, how we're addressing equity within the space of design, and ways that we can bring equity into our creative teams today through simple practice of improving our own internal cultures. And so with that, quick agenda for you all today. We'll go over a little bit of history about our organization, ways that we can create more equity within our design teams that ultimately influence diversity. And then lastly, depending on if we have time, a little bit about other organizations doing really fascinating work in this space as well. And so we talked a little bit about our organization and kind of a little bit of background of why we got started in what we do. Our first goal was trying to address all of the issues, right, with design pipeline and issues with diversity of different folks being represented, right? I had asked many of my colleagues who've been in the industry for much longer than I have, decades and decades, and asked them the simple question of how many Black queer folks have you worked with? How many Latinx queer folks have you worked with? How many trans designers have you worked with? And surprisingly, the answer was very few or none in certain instances. And so, a little disturbing answer, especially as we talk about equity and just representation as a whole. And I think in the space of design, we see so many marginalized communities who are really, really creative, but within the scope of especially UX, digital design, the intersection of technology, we don't really see that translate necessarily. And I think as we move forward with digital technology, social media, and all these different tools that we use becoming more integrated with our lives, we have to bring more diversity into the mix of creators so that we can ensure what we're putting out is more inclusive and more accommodating of different identities. And so the first one is a little diagram of just how we're recruiting, right? We're oftentimes recruiting directly just from the design community. And especially as we talk about diversity, one, we already understand that there is a severe deficit in representation. And so when we keep fetching from the design community, we end up in a closed system where we continue to uplift people who have been able to make it into the system, right? This general pipeline is based off of educational curriculums, whether it's boot camps, universities, different companies that they've worked at previously as a designer, or they've been able to pivot, right, through the means of studying on their own, having the resources to access that study as well. But unfortunately, what we're starting to see with the rise in just capitalist culture is just courses are becoming more and more expensive as this industry flourishes more. We're starting to see a lot of creators in this space who once provided education products for free, starting to put a high price tag towards that education. And when we talk about mentorship, although it might seem that we're connecting more people, the number of folks connected to high quality mentorship and partnership opportunities is steadily decreasing. And what we're seeing more are these low touch opportunities as well. And so at the end of the day, all of these things are impacting all of the designers that are available to be hired. And so a big reason of why we started this organization was to ultimately increase the pipeline by reaching out to folks who are outside of this community. And for either companies, recruiters, design leaders, or just people looking to do work impacting our industry, we have to increase the pipeline, not just bringing people right into our organization, but simply bringing people into the design community. Because ultimately, once they're in the community, they're in the system and everything will continue as normal. And so really the issue that we can tackle as a community together is to figure out ways that we can increase this pipeline. And so a couple advice, and this part is for anyone looking to increase diversity within your workforce with immediate tangible tips. But a few things. The first one is looking at the way we attract, right? Design into either the community or designers into the community or within our company. First is the reputation, right? Either the industry or the company has, how it has treated historically marginalized communities. Along with that, how representative is it, right, of marginalized communities? And so too often as companies, we think we are, the best candidate for all these diverse hires. We want all these people, but we often don't take into account so many of the things that presides before that impact people deciding to go into a company. And especially as we talk about diversity, especially folks who come from marginalized identities really struggle to be one of the only people in their intersectional identity within a company, is because this concept of tokenization, right? They are often used and paraded as the identity of a social movement. So, for example, this is a really common feedback, especially with trans designers as they enter companies. They are now the face of pride and the face of LGBTQ uplifting being done by the company. And I just hear from time and time again, folks really want to have consent before companies do this. And so my advice here is, if you are pulling folks and using their stories, especially in an organization, definitely ask for consent first. But the second part is, as we talk about how our company looks, how our company acts, and how our company impacts, we can simply do work with the community at large to gain some of this reputation or gain some of this rapport before we even start bringing our community in, right? The next part is in terms of engagement. So this is a really important piece, and I stress this a lot with organizations who want to increase diversity within their pipeline, to just engage with the community versus thinking that it has to directly correlate with a hire, right? There are so many organizations already doing work with these specific marginalized communities. Why not partner with them, right? Too often we think that we have to solve the issue of race or the issue of equity against many different intersectional identities all by ourselves and figure it out. But again, this is a huge concept, especially in the design community, that we're trying to dismantle, where we center ourselves with creating the solution and centering the problem with us. And in this aspect, we can simply be collaborators, working with folks, doing work with these community members. And oftentimes these leaders in these communities will have advice and solution for folks as well. And then the last one, just blind applications. So thinking about ways we can remove specific attributes of an identity to remove bias from the application process, whether it's the name, the location, address, anything like that to help establish more equity. And what I will say is there's just so many opportunities here. And if anybody wants to gain more insider advice, definitely check out our organization, qtbipoc.design, or reach out to us via our contact form, and we'd be happy to connect you with additional resources or other leaders in your neighborhood. And so moving over to our own teams, right? Just a little bit of insight into state of design even, right, where we're at. So kind of laddering up into pipeline issues and thinking about what has been reported as some statistics. There's so many stats I've seen floating around, but what I'll throw at you all today, which is an interesting stat that came out of a collaboration with AIGA and Google Design that happens every few years, where they assess the state of design with tens of thousands of designers here in the United States. We see the population of designers across different ethnicities not having shifted since 2016. We see a severe lack of representation with the Black community, especially, right? And some folks will argue, well, Asian folks in the United States are represented more in design than they are in the United States population, but a big movement has been disaggregating the Asian population as a whole to identify different subsets, right? Whether it's East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, to better understand who is being represented around the world. Currently, out of 7.7 billion people in this world, I believe the largest majority is the Asian population. So while it might be big in number, when we actually break it up into smaller subsets, we can immediately see where disparity might exist. The next part is the statistics on LGBTQIA designers. In 2019, when this report was done, they were often paid half than those who were not identifying as LGBTQIA. And we see this time and time and time again, especially with marginalized identities, being paid much lower and also holding most of the lower positions within a company. And so while 71.983% might be the representation, as we take a look at leadership, for example, design leadership, the majority of the population represented is white identities, with Asian, Latinx, and Black populations being very, very low. And then lastly, diversity just coming up time and time again as something that's really important, especially for folks who are, tackling these issues. Understand that overall designers, design community really want to impact their own teams. And the more we can talk about it, this is how we're going to solve for this, especially as a community. One thing I want to provide you all with is just a little bit of insight into some of the terminologies that's being used in this space, right? We hear the words diversity, inclusion, equity, and the importance of the vocabulary is also how we can identify what might be lacking within a space, yeah? And so just to kind of use these images as a reference to describe the differences between these three, diversity, right, is this representation of different perspectives within a room. Their experiences within the room, another story, right? This is where inclusion is important. Oftentimes people say, well, we're an inclusive event, right? For example, and say, the door's open, you come in. However, inclusion is more than that. Inclusion is the question of how are we inviting in people of different identities? How are we creating a more equalized experience? And so for this example, the fence is gone and folks are wearing the same uniform to reduce separatism. And then last part, this word equity. Yeah, why this is really different. Equity is loosely defined as the redistribution of power, and power can show up as money, power can show up as time, power can show up as resources. It is simply the redistribution of that so that folks who come from marginalized identity or different physical, mental levels to have a similar experience as those who may not need the specific resources, money, time, attention. And so as you enter your spaces, see if you can start using some of these vocabularies to help identify what exactly is the space missing, right? Is it diversity? Is it inclusion? Is it equity? And for the sake of this presentation, I'll generally refer to equity, particularly because equity, the work of it is what really truly impacts folks and their experience. And before we get into the specific advice, the last nugget I will leave with you all is we oftentimes, right, have this pipeline of all these folks we're hiring, but unfortunately due to our internal culture that we haven't solved for to provide equity, right, provide inclusion, we end up having people leave the system. We have a high attrition rate, and unfortunately for companies, we all know how expensive that is, but for the individual, just a horrible experience. And sometimes we have designers who just have such a bad experience that they leave the design industry as a whole. And so what I will share with you today is if you want to ultimately impact your pipeline, one part is working with the community, but the other part is just cleaning up your house, making sure the culture, the community that you have built within your company is equitable. And until the soil is fertile, doesn't matter how many seeds we plant into the ground, it will never germinate, right? And so really this work of diversity, equity, inclusion starts with really our existing culture. And so as an organization, we've been working to create many different models of how we look at this work of equity within our design industry. And as myself personally, I have a long history with the practice of yoga and the practice of meditation, and have been doing a lot of work advocating and activism for marginalized identities. And where design sits is really ultimately at the center. And as we talk about how we can build more equitable culture, it is sometimes less around the tactics, more so the relationships, right? So on the chart on the left, where you see the pink arrows, we believe with our organization that equity is built between the relationships that we hold with one another. And based off of this, we created a 4-pronged structure that helps to remind us about the importance of these relationships and how we can become more conscientious and mindful of this. Relationship is culture, right? Ultimately. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop it into the chat as well. Yeah. And so for the first one, the concept of grounding. Let me pull up the bullets. The concept of grounding is really the concept of first establishing the principles that we want to set forth, right? What is this higher order vision statement that you want to achieve, accomplish, or continuously remind yourself of. And the second part, this one is really important, of just ways we can continuously remind ourselves with this, right? Too often we have a organization charter or goal or mission statement or something that we've codified, but yet it sits in a document, an unopened doc, or something that we open right first week of starting work, and we just never have touched it again. And in this work, it is to also continuously remind ourselves ways. And some ways that I've seen people institute it very intelligently has been, one, maybe through the company website, putting the mission and the values directly in the footer, and it's reiterated on each page. I've seen organizations put a reminder into their signatures as a quote, instead of a random quote that we pull, the company's mission and the values. And for some recruiters, just this use of post-its or just reminders somewhere that helps us center ourselves back in this practice. Yeah. This one has been resonating quite a lot in our different presentations we've done, which is this concept of safe spaces within especially our design teams. We are too often butting heads all the time when we present designs, believing that there is one solution that is going to solve for everything, right? And we forget that the concept of design, the concept of collaboration, the concept of coming together to work on this craft and artistry and creativity needs to start from a place of non-judgment, right? And so the first advice is perhaps it is just a shift in language where we announce, right? What is this space? Judgment-free, inclusive, safe, whatever it is, right? And then perhaps it is to also create emptiness, the concept of maybe just slowing down in a meeting, maybe adding pause in our meeting, maybe providing documents before and after a meeting, or ways that we can become more accommodating of different ways of working, especially as we think about folks who are creative, right? In the design industry, we forget that there are creative ways to come and show up for the work, right? And also, especially for folks who are in a client service industry, we give clients 24 to 48 hours to respond and give us feedback. Yet when it's our own teams, we set a limit of 2 to 4 hours or until end of day to provide feedback or another round of revisions, right? Why is it that we keep treating other people, our clients, so much better than our own team members? And when we operate from that perspective, is it a sustainable business, right? And then lastly, this concept of braveness. We see braveness showing up through this concept of healthy banter. And in the situation where we're sometimes surrounded by so many people who think like us, who design like us, who create like us, sometimes when we present our ideas, everyone just agrees with it and everything is great, right? Of course, it's great to hear, but unfortunately, this stifles diversity of thought. And in the situation, we are faced with just an onslaught of agreeability. Potentially ask somebody to be the devil's advocate or to invite the person to poke holes into our work. Invite them to point out, what might you not be seeing with this? When we talk also about power dynamics that exist in the system, we often forget we sometimes play the role of a boss, a manager to somebody else. And we often forget to be in that other position. There are all these different thoughts that go through our mind, right? Should I critique that? Well, no, I want the job still, right? I don't want to, jeopardize my position. And so there's just so many, even especially in UX, right? The UX domain, as a facilitator of the test, for example, right, versus participant, so many layers of power dynamic where we don't invite in folks to disagree. And in this instance, you find yourself with just so many people just going with the flow. Invite it in, ask for it. And then number 3, which is around iteration and building solutions that exist. The first and foremost piece is honoring the past, right? Too oftentimes, when we create content, create designs, or create projects, we come from the perspective of having to dismantle something to create something new, right? But unfortunately, when we do that, we lose all of the insights from previous generations. And what ends up happening actually as they observe phenomena is we end up in a cyclical nature. So why history also repeats itself in many, many different instances is because we're often so dedicated to solving the issues with our previous generation that we forget the issues or the reasons why people did a certain thing the generation and the generation before that impacted one over the other. And so in the work of design or in the work of innovating and impacting our culture, we have to understand where people came from and why people do the things they do so that we can create something that develops on top of it, iterates above it. Perfectionism. This one is an interesting topic. I've done a couple presentations on this with many different creative teams, especially in the design industry. We talk about perfectionism. Everyone's a recovering perfectionist, and everyone's just so ingrained with many of these practices, right? And it shows up in a couple different ways, right? The first way is the concept of there is one solution that will rule them all, right? Or the one solution that's going to be absolutely perfect, right? Unfortunately, what we see in tech right now with social media and all the things around us, right? Is it perfect? Not really, right? Not the best. And so many products that exist, is it perfect? It could be improved, right? And so in this work, we have to also understand and acknowledge our biases and our limitations, and sometimes becoming open, right, to many different ideas and, again, diverse perspectives. When we can't embrace different thoughts, we can't embrace different people. Yeah. Um, Perfectionism is also rooted with the concept of colonialism and white supremacy, where also there's this concept of, right, a certain way that's going to be better than everyone else, or certain race, or certain identity. And just even think about when was the last time you felt, right, diminished because you had an idea and somebody just either didn't take the time to understand you, didn't take, maybe a chance on your idea, and just put yourself in the position to feel again what that felt like. And we oftentimes forget that even though we may have the answer or we may know, what we should do, we sometimes enter design critiques or the way we engage with one another in such a harsh manner, and we just shut each other down. And we often forget that what we sacrifice in short-term wins, we lose in long-term negativity and long-term culture degradation. And so ultimately, it starts little by little. And just going to number 3 here, ways we can create more consistent behavior where we're so focused on maybe perhaps the little iterations versus the big picture thinking that sometimes holds us back or completely dismantles all the work that has been done before. And in the last model, in terms of reinforcing behavior, we just were talking about this before, but this concept of negative feedback, right, to drive immediate actions. And we oftentimes forget that all of this plays a role in this bigger picture, especially for folks who are parents or know people who just had children, babies. The test for you all is observe how many times the word no shows up in a conversation, how many times the word yes shows up in conversation, right? There are things definitely we want our children, our babies, or whoever we're caretaking to do, but we oftentimes use negative feedback to get our immediate action that we need, right? No, don't eat that. No, don't go over there. Versus the positive reinforcement is to acknowledge what are some of the intentions, positive intentions behind it, right? And where I often see culture degrading is through this short-term win of negative consequences that we end up degrading the morale of all the folks around us. Sure, our immediate project might be a success, but at what cost, right? Next is this practice of amplifying action. So with this really simple practice of if you see something good, say it's good, right? Start with the little things and continuously empower, especially folks of marginalized identities, particularly because it doesn't happen often enough. I was actually watching a YouTube video last night where there was a 14-year-old diver applying for Olympics, right? So he was diving, and he has to do 5 or 6 rounds of it, and he was 14 years old, and the the judges or the people, right, who speak into the mic and have critiques, they just kept bringing up his age over and over and over and over again. There's a couple comments around how he was not exceptional enough, that he just needed a little bit more coaching, or it's just not time for him yet, or all these things. And yet, as you look at what he does, and you look at his age, right, 14 years old, competing at the same level of Olympic athletes, I think that is beyond phenomenal, beyond extraordinary, right? But there are certain traits, right, attributes, in this case, age, that played a role in why he wasn't able to get particularly the same type of feedback as other counterparts who may be older, right? So the same thing applies to different marginalized identities, where there's certain traits or certain attributes that people sometimes unconsciously resonate against that impact the way people want to provide feedback in a nicer way. And then lastly, leading by example. So in this instance, exemplify what equity, what inclusion, what diversity looks like in your space, right? So that other people can see what you're doing and then implement it in their practice. Ultimately, we cannot usher it in all by ourselves because, right, it is unsustainable. We cannot keep trying to mend and trying to fix everything. We have to figure out ways that we can amplify this. At the end of the day, allowing people to feel seen and be seen, this is a core tenet of design, creativity, innovation. So many facets of design were once demonized during its time is now heralded as masterpieces, right? But what was keeping either an individual or community or population from seeing that, right? And the concept of unconscious bias is unconscious for a reason, meaning I even have biases, even though, I've put in a tremendous amount of time. I acknowledge there are different aspects that I just will not understand, particularly because I have not lived that experience, right? So the example is uh, a lived experience of a woman, right? For example, as a man, I do not have the expertise or the experience to understand it, right? Or other ethnicities, for example. And so in that instance, we ask questions, invite dialogue, understand one another. And when we have to make decisions on behalf of others, we invite those with the lived experiences to come help us make the best decision for our community. And so I'll leave 15 minutes for Q&A, but just before we go, I just want to share a couple of organizations doing really fascinating work. National Equity Project, Creative Reaction Lab, Project Inkblot, and their ways, I definitely recommend everyone check them out, is innovating the way we look at design, think about design, ideate on design. And each of these organizations have also started codifying, creating their own design thinking models that start to integrate more history, more community, and more retrospectives into our processes. And with that, I'm trying to see. Okay, here we go. And 2 lessons, lastly, for us. At the end of the day, creating equity, dismantling system inequity is a lifelong process. It might feel really heavy at times. World is changing all the time. New information comes up. Totally empathize. Sometimes we're in this mode of, oh my gosh, like how do I navigate this? And maybe it's not this gargantuan thing that we have to chase after. Maybe it just starts something small, right? Maybe it's just this concept of making it just better for one person tomorrow, today, right? Imagine if we all just showed up for one individual today, right? Regardless of who they are, what they do, just one person today. Imagine how tomorrow would be for all of us. It would be a completely different world. And so with this, hope you have insights, you have some thoughts, and take this to improve the way that you see design, equity, inclusion, and diversity within your communities.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We really appreciate the talk and all the slides and all the information. We have some questions that I aggregated, and I'd like to go ahead and start off with the first one. It is, what changes have you been able to see happen in a company that begins to have a conversation around diversity and inclusion? In particular, what are the effects for that company, like benefits or anything like that?
Yeah. I'll give an example, a really clear example that I've seen personally is more than the conversation, just what are the tactical methods, right, where we honor diversity and inclusion? And the first one is pronoun use, right? And so in terms of pronoun use, I started to include it in my email. I started to include it in my LinkedIn, Instagram, all these different places. And I started to notice a shift in who was actually approaching me and who was talking to me. And so in applying some of these tools and shifting our culture, we may radically see a shift in who is even talking and what conversations are happening. Again, it's something that we don't know until we know, right? And so for many folks who, especially this practice of pronouns, some folks are like, oh, I don't get it. My example I share with you all is just try and see how it shifts for the people around you. And in doing that, I am much bigger proponent of that practice and many other practices now, particularly because I see so much benefit that come out of it. And for organizations, typically with more work being done on equity, inclusivity, and diversity, you see different identities, different folks from different communities stand up, wanting to share their stories, right? Believing that what they put out there is going to be honored, it's going to be protected, right? It's going to be uplifted. People want to be more engaged with a company, right? Versus just keeping it as this, business bubble, but integrating their whole selves into the work, right? Showing up authentically as they are. And on kind of the bridge of that is when you allow people to show up authentically, just as themselves, meetings, work, it just becomes so much easier, right? It's just everything's just so smooth because people just show up as they are. And yeah, I just recommend everyone to maybe pick up a few tools and implement it and just see, the difference it makes. But definitely it's not something that you'll see overnight, right?
Mhm.
It's something that you'll see over some time. Yeah.
And what are some of the tools that you would recommend that they pick up for an initiative like this?
Yeah, I would say, definitely pick up some of the things that we had talked about in our presentation today. If I were to take a couple of the main bullet points, the first one is honoring diversity, not through people per se, but maybe diversity of thought, right? Diversity of practice. How does that show up within your workplace? Because if we can't honor diversity of thought and diversity of processes and diversity of different ways of working, we're never going to invite different types of people into our workplaces. And then with that, the other advice is to create a safe space where we can nurture these diverse ways of thinking and diverse ways of working.
Got it. Okay.
Mhm.
Awesome. Next question. What strategies have been most effective in getting support from company leadership?
That's a good one. I don't use a lot of statistics. I've actually stopped using as many statistics lately or KPIs, particularly because here's what I'll tell you with KPIs. It's a lose-lose road in the future, right? We try to validate diversity, equity, inclusion through KPIs. At one point in the future, they're going to push us. Why isn't it delivering on what you promised, right? Or on the flip side, well, we want these KPIs to be more increased, right? But if Silicon Valley and tech companies can validate anything, right? We have trillion-dollar companies who struggle every single day with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if a trillion-dollar company struggles with it, money and how much money a business makes is clearly not the reason why we're not able to have more diversity, equity, inclusion within our organizations. It's a very hard pill to swallow for some folks because some folks will say, we need money for resources, whatnot. But again, a lot of what I shared, right? Creating safe spaces within our meetings, does it really require money? Maybe training, but start with your own, smaller meetings. So what I will say is I really appreciate the movement that's coming out of the accessibility space in terms of validating accessibility needs. And they've actually decoupled, many of the leaders there decoupled from KPIs as well, saying we are doing this not because it's going to improve the business, but because this is the right thing to do. This is the human thing to do. How do we validate somebody being worth more than somebody else? Right? Especially for core websites or digital experiences that are becoming more integrated, right? It's integrated within our cars, right? It's touching every single touch point. And so in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the question I ask is, who doesn't deserve to be seen, right? Whose voices don't deserve to be heard. I think everybody deserves to be seen and deserves to be heard. And with that, we have to just do the right human thing to be able to give people the space to be authentically themselves. Yeah.
Got it. And on that, related to that, is how does diversity, equity, inclusion affect some of the products that companies produce?
Yeah, there's so many McKinsey reports out there that actually say it improves product, improves customer loyalty, it improves stickiness. At the end of the day, when we just have different people helping to validate, that's an important point, right? Validate our solutions of what we create that works for others, it just will work for others. And instead of centering, especially ourselves, as this, godlike figure that can extrapolate insights, figure out, how it's implemented, and all of these things, is to also sit back and say, I understand I have my unconscious biases, right? Designers, understanding design has not allowed us to escape from unconscious biases at all, right? And we just have to honor lived experiences as well, right? Where people have decades and decades and decades of experiences having been this specific identity. They, for sure, are the expert of their experiences, right? And then the last part I will leave you all is this concept of intersectional identities. Also meaning when we have different parts of ourselves, right, where they intersect, right, make this matrix, we also get unique characteristics and unique ways of living and understanding life that come up, right? And so especially for immigrant folks who migrate to America or many other Western parts of the world, we cannot just say, right, you are, for example, in my situation, I cannot be the sole voice of an Asian, right, around the world. That because there's so many different intersectional identities with Asian folks, right? Those in the United States, those in Australia, those in Canada, Europe, different parts of Asia, right? Many different generations. We have to be able to figure out how we can honor that. And especially as we create more products, right? Again, touching so many people by the billions. Even as we think about, right, what is 1%? That's 1 million people that we completely ignore, And so I think what we need to do, especially as a technology industry, is to have a reckoning of how are we honoring everyone before we go chasing for more. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And the last question is, what strategies have been most effective for you in building relationships with coworkers, especially to support these conversations?
Yes, I love this question. So whenever I start working on a new team, I always set aside one-on-ones with folks I'm working with or I'm managing. Such a great way to start setting up the rapport, precedents, and a couple questions I ask immediately. The first question is, understanding, them, their background. I try not to make it all about work, but just try to understand them, right? But a couple questions I ask. The first question is, how can I support you? How can I support your work, right? You tell me how you best work without me implementing or any methodologies, whatnot. Just understand, okay, are you someone that's more online, offline, in person? You know, and then some other questions I could prod a little further that's also really fascinating. One question is, when was the last time that you didn't feel seen? What happened, right? Some of the answers will really surprise you. You can also ask this question with your coworkers, and sometimes it's so heartbreaking, and it's some of the stuff that we might even have been aware of. And then the next question I like to ask is, when was the last time you felt seen? You felt uplifted? We're always chasing after things that we can do for others, and we rarely ask others. And that question is a really great way to just ask others what's worked for them. And so I love these 3 questions, right? The first one is, how can I show up for you? How can I show up for your work? How can I help uplift your work, right? The second question is, when was the last time you haven't felt seen? What happened? And the third question is, when was the last time you felt seen? And what happened? And asking those 3 questions, it will show you so much about specific individuals and what really matters to them. And with that, you can figure out ways of collaborating in the best way possible.
Got it. Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for answering all of our questions, and thank you for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
And over here on the slide, this is the best way for everyone to contact you.
Yes, it is. So definitely check out our organization, QT BIPOC Design. If you're a queer designer of color, we provide free resources. We have monthly events, courses, and we have UX Bootcamp. And we're just figuring out ways that we can really reduce and remove all the barriers needed to get into design, because representation is so much needed. If you are an ally, if you want to help partner with us, love to collaborate with you. We are also seeking any funding or any opportunities where, if you have corporate sponsorship that you'd like to provide us, we'd love to share with you our mission and see where we might be able to align on that. And here are my socials. I've been more active on LinkedIn, so you can definitely check out some of my stuff on LinkedIn as well. But my Twitter username is different because my full name wouldn't fit, unfortunately.
God, I have the same problem myself.
I know. They need to change that. It just
give me two more characters in the name or something like that.
No, it's just I know. I think they will in the future. It's just a matter of time. But again, right, this is where bias comes into play. If they had a team with a bunch of long names, they would have been like, this isn't working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, well, awesome. Thank you very much. Before we close, I just want to give some closing announcements. The OKC Design Tech, our next meetup will be July 28th, unless we post differently on Meetup. So please be sure to check that out. Also, Techlahoma, this is a Techlahoma sponsored event, and Techlahoma abides by our code of conduct. If during this meetup, anybody had felt unsafe or anything like that, or there's any questions, please reach out to one of the leaders in Techlahoma and we'll kind of address that. We want this to be a free, safe space for everybody, especially with what was talked about today. So just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and we appreciate all of your support. Thank you.